So, guys, in college, you do a lot of dumb things, right? Well, I remember, I don't even know if I should be telling this story, so I apologize. But anyway, so I was in college, and it was free zoo day at the Oklahoma City Zoo. And it's a bunch of guys from my social club, and we're all walking around, and one of them says, "Hey," they go to this guy, his name's Braden. "Braden, do the tiger trick." And Keaton Whalen, close your ears. Anyway, so he goes up there, he climbs over the fence that is before the fence, and he does this. And what happens is that tiger goes from laying down to running towards the fence. And it was terrifying. And we quickly told him to climb back over that fence or you might die. But speaking of tigers, though, there's a little article I read. It says they're one of the most majestic creatures out there. And it's true. They're beautiful. I mean, look at that face. If I didn't think I would lose an arm, I would want to pet it. But anyway, but for many years, these beautiful creatures puzzled researchers. And it's true, they did. Because it seems that when the tigers hunt, they have a remarkable capacity for causing their prey to be paralyzed and freeze in fear. It's a capacity greater than any of the other big cats. As the tiger charges forward towards its hopeless prey, it lets out a spine-chilling roar. And now you would think that would be enough to cause the prey to turn and take tail the opposite direction, but what happens is something different altogether. They freeze. And it's in that moment of freezing where the tiger isn't able to pounce and to be able to get its food. The prey becomes tiger food. And so what happened was at the turn of the century, scientists at the Fauna Communications Research Institute in North Carolina discovered that why you're likely to freeze and spot rather than run when a tiger charges. It says when a tiger roars, it lets out sound waves that are audible, but the ones that sound terrifying, but it also lets out a sound at a frequency so low that you can't hear it, but you feel it. And so the tiger emerges from the undergrowth, flashing of its colors, the sound of its roar, and the impact of the unheard but felt sound momentarily paralyzed. So even though there may be time to avoid the tiger, you were actually tricked into standing still long enough for the tiger to leap at you. Now, our fears honestly happen in the same way, don't they? They paralyze us into inactivity, and when the real threat is not immediately upon us, part of overcoming the challenges before us is recognizing is the ability is for our fear of what might happen to stop us from dealing well with the challenge. In other words, our fears can paralyze us just like that of a tiger's roar, and keep us from focusing and fixing our eyes on what matters most. And if we're being honest, our society at times has a hard time keeping focused, especially when we start thinking about everything that is going on in the world to make us afraid. And our fear can sometimes, if we're not careful, lead us to inactivity, and it can keep us from focusing on what truly matters most. Would you not agree with that? And we have things that, and there are always things that are fighting for our attention. There are always things that are then, if we're not fighting for our attention, there are things that are coming up to us that are telling us, hey, this should be fighting for your attention, right? We deal with all of these different attention grabbers. We deal with problems at our work. We deal with problems in our family. We deal with problems
with our kids. We deal with problems with what the news is now telling us is a problem that we didn't know a problem was. I remember I think it was back whenever we were in the pandemic, we had the big thing, we're on lockdown and everybody's scared of the lockdown and people are like, I haven't been outside in 45 years. And you know what came on the news like pretty much the next day after that? Murder hornets. By the way, you should be afraid of murder hornets, okay? I don't even know, but the idea that they're murdering me, I don't know, is scary, all right? And there's always new things that are coming up. Now we've got monkeypox, and we've got all kinds of other things. You should be afraid of this. You should be worried about this. You should be thinking about this. And what happens is I realize is it makes us spread our gaze to so many different places than the things that truly matter in our lives. They can make our faith challenging, especially as we live in a world with so much fear, so much problems with scheduling conflicts that seem to get in the way of building a relationship with Christ, of knowing Christ, living for Christ, moving to the next direction, moving to the next thing. The winds and the waves, so to speak, of our lives keep stacking and gathering around us. And it makes me wonder, is it possible that our society has helped us create an opportunity where our priorities have become out of whack? And our focus is not always where it should be. But don't worry, we're not the first one to ever be distracted by the winds and the waves of life. Actually, there's a story in Matthew where somebody took their eye off the ball. And we're going to turn with this. You'll turn with me over to Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Again, that's Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. So Matthew 14, starting in verse 22, it says this: Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. That's what you do on a Saturday, right? And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come out to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" When they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were there in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So our setting is simple. The disciples are needing to get onto the next destination. It seems to me they spend quite a bit of time on the boat. And it never feels like the boat situations or the boat scenes are always the most fun to be a disciple on. Have you ever thought about that? Jesus calming the storm. Hey, we're going to die. We're going to drown. And now, oh, it's a ghost. But anyway, so they see a man walking on the water, but really what it is Jesus is like, oh, maybe I've spent a little bit too much time. How am I going to catch up to him? You know what I'll do? I'll go for a walk. I'll go for a walk on the water. And so they so Jesus is walking on the water, and the disciples see this man, and they think it's a ghost. It has to be a ghost because nobody can walk on water. And then eventually they realize that no, this person that is walking on water is actually Jesus. And then we see Peter. And I love Peter. Peter gets a lot of, bad things said about him, but let's focus on Peter for a moment. Peter is always the loudest one. When I was in school, we once went to a preaching conference, my entire homiletics class, and somebody had the idea to give everybody disciple names. I don't know, I guess there was 12 of us, and I drew the Peter straw, mainly just because I'm always the first one to say something. But anyway, so Peter is always the one who says something first. He's the one to me that at times responds first, and maybe doesn't always get all the details out there at the forefront. But Peter says, "Hey, Jesus, if that is you, tell me to come and I will come to you." And what does Peter do? He gets out of the boat and he starts to walk. And it's amazing. He's walking on water. He's doing this miraculous things. And then what happens? He starts to notice the winds and the waves. And what happens is fear overtakes Peter. And then that causes him to subvert his gaze off of Christ, and he begins to sink. Now, if you're us, is like, how could you take your eyes off of Jesus, Peter? How could you do this? Why are you, you were right there. But the thing is, I don't notice any of the other 11 getting out of the boat. And yet Peter was the one who said, I'm willing to get out of the boat. It's also interesting to me that, when Jesus was going and he says, Peter, you will deny me 3 times by the end of the night. And yet what does Peter say? I will die for you. If I remember correctly, he was the one out there who took that literally and cut off a man's ear. Peter is always the one that's like, if I say it, I'm going to do it. And then, of course, there's confusion and, there's moments where he's doing really well, but then there's moments that he falls short. Peter took his gaze off of Christ. And he started noticing and realizing all of the fear and the problems and the issues and the situations of his current predicament, of being out in the middle of winds and roaring waves. And he begins to sink. And he cries out to Christ, "Save me." And Jesus says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt? I'm right here. You know I'm the Son of God. You know I have power over the wind and the waves and all of these other elements. Why did you doubt?" And of course, Jesus pulls him up from the water, but I think there is a simple lesson that we can take from this, especially as we think about our wind and wave-struck lives. And it's this: we have to strive every day to keep our focus on Christ. We cannot get distracted by the winds and the waves of life. Because let's face it, Peter was doing great until he took his eyes off of Christ. There are so many times in our lives we are doing great until we take our eyes off of Christ. Our marriages are great until we take our eyes off of Christ and we start taking our eyes on other things. Our careers can be great until we start taking our eyes off of Christ and the things that matter most, and then all of a sudden it becomes our king and everything else that we worship, and we all fall down to it. It's interesting what happens when we take our eyes off of Christ. Think about raising children, raising kingdom kids. It's great until we take our eyes off of Christ and we start taking our eyes and placing them on every other thing. We're doing great until we advert our focus and we move our focus on the things that matter most. Because let's face it, there will be winds and there will be waves in your life. There will be moments when it seems dire. There will be moments when you're questioning everything and you're wondering what to do, and the news is telling you now you need to focus on murder hornets. And we are paralyzed like that of a tiger about to charge because we feel it in our bones. And yet Jesus is in front of us telling us to come. And he's telling us to keep our focus on what matters most. And that's him. Because realistically, we do get the benefit of having the full Bible. We do get the benefit of knowing how the story goes. We do have the benefit of knowing the power of Jesus. And what that means then is that we need to remember to trust the one who healed the sick, gave sight to the blind, raised the dead, walked on water, and rose from the dead. Yet, we sometimes look at our issues and our struggles and everything going on, and we avert our eyes like Peter when we're stuck in sometimes when we think reality catches up with us, and yet what Christ is saying is, in reality, I have already won. In reality, Jesus has already rose from the dead. In reality, Jesus is the one who gives power to us. And Jesus is the one who has placed us in predicaments where we can succeed, but we have to have our focus on what matters most. And realistically, that is our relationship with Jesus Christ. And anything else that can get in the way of that, we need to stop putting so much energy into that. We have to focus and we have to think about where we are fixing our eyes. Because there will always be troubles. There will always be issues in your life. But God has given us the solution to those problems. It may not make the problems go away. It may not stop the storms, but Christ promised to be our umbrella in the storms. In other words, he shelters us, he keeps us safe. And when the winds and the waves seem like they're going to overtake our lives and we think we're about to sink, Jesus comes into our lives and says, "Quiet, be still." And he asks the question, do you still have no faith? Why did you doubt? Church, let's not focus on our doubts and not focus on all of our struggles. Instead of doing all of that, let us fix our eyes on Christ this week. And so this week, what I would ask that if you are having issues and you are having struggles, give that to God. It may not solve all your problems, but you don't have to carry that weight. You don't have to deal with all of that by yourself. And whenever you find yourself picking that back up again, because you will, give it back to God. And keep giving it back to God over and over and over again, and understand that we need to focus and fix our eyes on him.